Antony Loewenstein is a journalist and author of the Palestine Laboratory, and he's joining us live from Sydney. Always good to have you with us on Al Jazeera, Antony. So Israel knows that keeping control of these key parts of Gaza cannot be acceptable to Hamas or to Egypt. So why is it insisting on this?
Because it can. And because the US, really Biden and frankly Kamala Harris, have not really put any serious pressure on Israel, frankly, since October 7 last year. I don't think Washington would want a regional war, which I think the lack of a ceasefire in Gaza threatens that possibility, that it's quite much more likely that Iran or Hezbollah and Israel get involved in a serious regional catastrophe. But without any kind of serious pressure on Israel to actually remove troops, I noticed in your comment a minute ago, you say that Antony Blinken, who was in the region, said that the US is opposed to any kind of long-term Israeli presence in Gaza. Well, they say the same thing about the West Bank, and here we are 57 years on, and it's hardly temporary, it's permanent. And I think what you see here really, that I'm feeling and hearing more and more, is that what Israel is doing here is similar to Oslo. Oslo was negotiated for years, decades ago, creeping negotiations, while at the same time the occupation of the West Bank deepened and grew. This is a very similar situation in Gaza, where without massive pressure on Israel to actually forcibly remove any kind of military presence in Gaza, you will not see 10,000 settlers suddenly appearing in Gaza, but you might see some outposts of radical right-wing Jewish settlers. That is quite likely because the government in Israel, that's what they want.
But the international community would not allow Israeli settlers back into Gaza, would they?
Well, would they? I mean, the question is, when one talks the international community, that really is one country, which essentially is the US. I mean, much of the world, virtually the entire world, in fact, is against what's happening in the West Bank for over half a century. And firstly, I think you will find not small support within Israel itself for some kind of so-called, I mean, Israel would call it a security buffer. It's an occupation. The idea of separating the north and the south of Gaza, where Israel potentially has control of the north, some form of Palestinian group, whether it's Hamas or Palestine Authority, controls the south with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, if not more. I mean, the idea that the world would not accept this, I think my feeling is, and there was an interesting piece written in the last 24 hours by the editor of Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, essentially saying that Netanyahu's thinking, the Israeli government's thinking, is that, yes, the world's outraged, they express opposition to what this potentially means, occupation, but that pressure will go, the world will move on, and no one's going to care. Now, I think people will care, and there'll be pressure from civil society, boycotts, divestments, etc. But ultimately, will there be actual pressure from, say, a Harris presidency or a Trump administration? And Israel's betting that there will not be.
Do you think then that this ceasefire negotiations that are starting again in Cairo today, most people, as you're describing, including the families of captives being held in Gaza, don't think that Netanyahu is willing to compromise to get a ceasefire done? So what then is Israel trying to do by keeping the negotiations going?
Like I said before, you drag out negotiations with the illusion of believing in some kind of outcome when you know that your opposition, Hamas, is almost impossible to accept. They're not going to accept that kind of condition. Now, obviously, we don't know exactly what was discussed between Antony Blinken and Netanyahu, but ultimately, again, there is no serious pressure on Israel to relent. I do not see it. I haven't heard it for 10 plus months. And ultimately, without that pressure, the idea of endless negotiations, it is possible that there's some agreement struck where some hostages are released from Hamas captivity and some Palestinians are also released from Israeli jails. But the desire from Israel, which they've made very clear, is the war continues at the end of that period, because they want to maintain that military presence in Gaza. And again, within Israel itself, there's very little opposition to that. There are some Israelis, of course, who oppose it, to be sure, but not huge amounts of people. They don't. There are people who want the hostages back in Israel, totally understandably, of course. But ultimately, there is no serious international pressure yet from, frankly, the Arab countries, most of them, from the US, from the EU, actual pressure, not verbal pressure, economic pressure, threatening weapons, ending arms sales to Israel.
Do
None
you
of
see
that
that
so
changing,
far is on
Antony?
the table.
What will it take to change that? Because if that doesn't change, there can be nothing to help the Palestinians in Gaza, can there?
I'm not saying that there is no hope. I think civil society has been totally empowered, frankly, in the last 10 months. And in many states, there is going to be huge pressure on countries to either cut some kind of economic ties, arms ties. I see, for example, in growing amounts of countries, there's massive pressure on superannuation funds to cut ties with Israeli companies. I'm not suggesting for a second there's no hope. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that politically, without massive pressure in the US, particularly on a incoming Harris administration or even the Trump administration, this will not change. And that because the world has essentially accepted more than half a century of occupation of the West Bank, we're on the precipice of the world potentially, in inverted commas, accepting an occupation of Gaza unless there is massive pressure on Israel to stop it.
Antony Loewenstein, thank you as always for your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.